Would banning firearms reduce murder and suicide? A review of international and some domestic evidence. Don B. Cates and Gary Mauser. This study is rearing its head again. Harvard, 2007. Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy. The anti-gunners hate it. They try to debunk it by attacking the two individuals, Don and Gary.
Mm-hmm.
Introduction, let me read you this, and then we're going to go to our guest, which is Dr. John R. Lott, author of More Guns, Less Crime, 3rd edition. International evidence and comparisons have long been offered as proof of the mantra that more guns mean more deaths and that fewer guns, therefore, mean fewer deaths. Unfortunately, such discussions are all too often afflicted by misconceptions and factual error and focus on comparisons that are unrepresentative. It may be useful to begin with a few examples. There is a compound assertion that A, guns are uniquely available in the United States compared with other modern developed nations, which is why B, the United States has by far the highest murder rate. Though these assertions have been endlessly repeated, statement B is in fact false, and statement A is substantially so. Since at least 1965, the false assertion that the United States has the industrialized world's highest murder rate has been an artifact of politically motivated Soviet minimization designed to hide the true homicide rates. Since well before that date, the Soviet Union possessed extremely stringent gun control that were effectual by a police state apparatus providing stringent enforcement. So successful was that regime that few Russian civilians now have firearms and very few murders involve them. Yet manifest success in keeping its people disarmed did not prevent the Soviet Union from having far and away the highest murder rate in the developed world. More guns don't equal more crime? Dr. John Lott, how are you, my friend? It's always a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for giving us your time today.
Great to talk to you again. Thanks for having me on.
John, this Harvard study, Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, was 2007, and you're cited in this fairly great length in here. Obviously, you're familiar with this study?
Yeah, sure. I mean, some of the stuff like the discussion about crime rates in the Soviet Union, I had talked about in the bias against guns. But
right.
I mean, I guess my general feeling about the study is, while I agree with the conclusions, I'm not really sure, and I greatly appreciate both Don Cates and Gary Mauser. I don't really rely on cross-sectional data because I don't think that you're really able to account for a lot of facts. You know, a lot of people, the debate, they'll go and they'll selectively pick a few countries, and Gary and Don are right about that. You know, they'll say, look, the United States has a relatively high gun ownership rate compared to a country like the UK, and England has few guns and fewer murders, therefore it must be the high gun ownership rate that we have in the United States is causing the higher murder rate. And if you go and you look at other countries, if you just don't selectively pick a few, in fact, I mean, there's been studies from Jeff Myron back in 2001 in the Journal of Law and Economics and other places which look at all the countries for which the data is available, and they in fact find, if anything, there's the opposite relationship. I don't find, though, cross-sectional data very useful, even when it supports my position. And what I find a lot more convincing is if you look over time at some place like the UK, when they banned guns, murder rates went up. In fact, every place in the world that's banned guns. And you look at a place, there are lots of differences across places, but when you look at any place that's banned guns, you always see at least some increase, and often very large increases in murder rates and other types of violent crime. I'll give you a simple example of the problems with purely cross-sectional work, and that is a few years ago, the New York Times did a big report on the death penalty and murder rates, and they said, look, the states that have the death penalty have a higher murder rate than states without the death penalty. And so they claimed, if anything, maybe the death penalty actually caused murder rates to rise, but it surely didn't cause them to fall. The problem is that when you look at the states that didn't have the death penalty at the time, like Alaska, North and South Dakota, Vermont, they generally tended to be relatively small, relatively rural states that had always had low murder rates. What you really need to do, if you wanted to test that, is to see how murder rates changed before and after different states changed their laws. So it could be that the states that adopted the death penalty were the ones that had a reason to do so because they had high murder rates to begin with, and I think that's true. And it could be that the death penalty caused the murder rates to fall, but by not enough so it caused it to get as low as these rural, always low murder rate states, the murder rates in those places. So if you looked across places, it would make it look like the death penalty was associated with more murders rather than a drop. And so you really need to follow these places over time. And when you do, you in fact find that the death penalty reduces murder rates, the opposite of what you would get by that purely cross-sectional type of study. The second problem that I have with Cates and Mauser paper is that they rely on this small arms survey done by a fairly left-wing group out of Geneva. And it's really a study that, unfortunately, the data has driven so much of the debate at the UN on the Arms Trade Treaty and other places, and it's unfortunate because the data is really pretty useless. So, for example, they have the United States way out there by itself in terms of gun ownership rates at 88 guns per 100 people. I would have, first of all, measured it differently. I would have had the percentage of the population with guns rather than the number of guns per person. But the more important thing is the other countries that they had, like Switzerland, they claimed only had 47 guns per 100 people. Israel had only 7 guns per 100 people, they claim. And those are just bizarre claims. What they do in order to get those low numbers for other countries like Israel and Switzerland, just to take two examples, is in Israel, for example, gun possession is very widespread. A huge percentage of the population has guns. 15% of the adult Jewish population is allowed to carry handguns with them when they travel around outside their home. But the thing is, the Israeli government technically owns the guns. I mean, you may have possession of a gun for 5 decades, but the government technically owns it. And so when the small arms survey was put together, they essentially would assume that if the government technically owned the gun, even though it was in your possession, they wouldn't count that as a gun that an individual had. And since most of the guns, the vast majority of guns in Israel, are technically owned by the government, civilians are carrying them around or own them in their homes, they have an amazingly low gun possession rate there. Now, my question is, if you want to worry about or talk about what the risks or benefits of civilians having guns is, does it really matter who technically owns the gun? Or does it matter whether the gun's in your home or whether you're actually carrying it around? It seems to me the last measure is much more important. And there's the same problem I go through with Switzerland. And the reason why they do that is countries like Israel and Switzerland have huge gun possession rates.
This segment of Armed American Radio is being brought to you by the Gun Owners of America, America's no-compromise gun lobby. Become a member today. Visit gunowners.org. Join them, folks. I did. Welcome back. Welcome back indeed to the Crossbreed Holster Studios. I'm Mark Walters, filling your prescription for freedom.
But is there an easy way to distill through evidence, to distill an argument, that not so much to try and change someone's heart and mind, but to try and give them some facts, like, for instance, that this is not that violent of a country, or that this is not, I mean, that the gun statistics, for instance, the death statistics have both suicide and wrongful death and lawful killings, justifiable homicides, all mixed together. Is there a way of trying to get that across to people, to distill it down to a more rational number?
It's pretty easy just to go and look at how murder rates vary across countries. On my website, I have the murder rate data for, I guess, about 180 countries in 2007. You know, you can compare that to different measures of gun ownership or different types of restrictions. As I said, time series, looking at how murder rates change before and after you have some type of restriction or a ban, I think is more useful. And one powerful question, I think, to ask people is, can you name me one place in the world, just one, where guns have been banned, that, you know, either all handguns or all guns, and you've seen a drop in murder rates? Because for at least every place that we have crime data before and after a ban, I can't find one place. Every place that I look at, and I put up some information also on my website, you know, you see increases, often very dramatic increases in murder rates. You'd think if it's random, you'd at least find one or two places where murder rates had fallen after a ban. And I would think that that should at least cause people who are pushing hard for those types of rules to at least have to think twice. Why is it that they can't point to any places that have banned guns that murder rates have gone down? I think there's a simple reason we find the relationship that we do, and that is when you ban guns, you have to ask who it relatively disarms. And I think it's pretty clear it's much more likely to disarm law-abiding citizens who obey the rules than it is to disarm criminals. And to the extent that you disarm law-abiding citizens relative to criminals, you actually see it's easier for criminals to commit crime, and you see increases in violent crime rates, and that's what we observe. Those are two simple points that I would make.
Thank you. And that's great. It's such a beautifully reasoned argument. Now we have to figure out how to get people who do business only in emotion to accept reason.
Well, that's the most difficult aspect, Charles, is getting to that low-information voter to spur them to act, to think. And that's very difficult, as you well know. Shows like this, shows like yours, Dr. Lott's exposure in his books. But you have to, you can lead them. You can lead them there, but you got to make them drink it. And it can be, that's a daunting task sometimes. Charles, great questions, man. Thank you for calling in. Dr. Lott, you mentioned the murder rates. And this study does a pretty good job, I think. It mentions in here violence, the decisiveness of social factors. One reason the extent of gun ownership in a society does not spur the murder rate is that murderers are not spread evenly throughout the population. Analysis of perpetrator studies shows that violent criminals, especially murderers, almost uniformly have a long history of involvement in criminal behavior. So it would not appreciably raise violence if all law-abiding responsible people had firearms, because they are not the ones who rape, rob, or murder. Dr. Lott, isn't that common sense?
I hope so. I mean, I've been making that argument since the first edition of More Guns, Less Crime.
Right.
You look at the data, and you find that about 90% of adult murderers have an adult violent criminal record. You have about 89% of juvenile murderers have a juvenile criminal record. These people are, pretty easy to identify. They're not your common citizen that are out there. They tend to have long histories of social problems. They tend to have, be very geographically concentrated in urban areas. 75% of the counties in the United States have 0 murders in any given year. Those also tend to be the counties where gun ownership rates are highest. You have 3%, a little bit over 3% of the counties in the United States account for over 70% of the murders. And even within those few counties that account for the vast majority of the murders, it's very heavily concentrated within tiny areas within those counties. A large amount of it is directly or indirectly related to gang activity.
Right, of course.
But if people want to be afraid of anybody, I would tell them the type of people who are most likely to use violence are people who have violent criminal history.
Who have a history. And, here we go into the break. I'll leave you with this. Then when we come back, we'll discuss it further. As the respective examples of Luxembourg and Russia suggest, individuals who commit violent crimes will either find guns despite severe controls or will find other weapons to use. Geez, imagine that. Armed American Radio continues. Take a listen to some of this. I mentioned this Harvard study with my guest, John Lott, and the reason I'm doing this is because it's rearing its head again. It's making some news now. During these 2 decades, referring to the 80s and 90s, keep in mind that this was written in 2007 in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy. During these 2 decades, while Britain and the Commonwealth were making lawful firearm ownership increasingly difficult, more than 25 states in the United States passed laws allowing responsible citizens to carry concealed handguns. Of course, that number is higher today. There are now 40 states, that number is now 50, where qualified citizens can obtain such a handgun permit. Let's say 50 states have it on the books. You may not be able to get a permit in a handful of those states. Hawaii, and a number of others. As a result, the number of U.S. citizens allowed to carry concealed handguns in shopping malls, on the street, or in their cars has grown to 3.5 million men and women. Again, that number's higher. Economists John Lott and David Mustard have suggested that these new laws contributed to the drop in homicide and violent crime rates. Based on 25 years of correlated statistics from all the more than 3,000 American counties, Lott and Mustard conclude that adoption of these statutes has deterred criminals from confrontation crime and caused murder and violent crime to fall faster in states that adopted this policy than in states that did not. Now, there's a footnote down here, and this is why this is intense reading, because you can't skip these footnotes. And I'm going to quote right now, and then I'll get John's perspective. Several critics have now replicated Lott's work using additional or different data, additional control variables, or new or different statistical techniques they deem superior to those Lott used. Interestingly, the replications all confirm Lott's general conclusions. Some even find that Lott underestimated the crime reductive effects of allowing good citizens to carry concealed guns. Dr. John Lott, welcome back. Care to comment on that?
Right. Well, there's been a lot of research that's been done. I have, in the third edition of More Guns, Less Crime, I have a table that kind of lists a lot of the work. I'm sure the study that you're just reading from lists some papers, though that's a little bit older.
Right.
And, I think it's generally right that a lot of people have looked at this in a lot of different ways. Whether you look at murder rates or robbery rates or rape rates, no refereed academic publication has found a bad effect from allowing people to carry concealed handguns. The debate has been over how large the benefits are. I'd say over two-thirds claim that crime falls, and as the thing you're just reading, some claim that to have even larger drops than what I originally found, and about a little bit less than a third claim that they can't find statistically significant effects. So when you even look through their stuff, the vast majority of their results show benefits, and I think I can say what they do that causes them not to find an effect and why that's biased. But, I think if Judge Richard Posner last December, when he struck down Illinois' ban on concealed carry, he went through all the critics of concealed carry and basically came to the conclusion, he said, look, you read all these studies, just the critical ones. He didn't look at the ones that were supportive, and he said the worst that they can claim is that there's no change in crime rates. And he said that's not enough. The state of Illinois has to show that there's a danger or a cost to preventing people from carrying concealed, and that even if you take these critics of concealed carry as being accurate, and he wasn't passing judgment on whether they were accurate or not, but he said even if you take them as being the definitive studies, no one is, the state's not meeting its burden. The absolute worst that they can show is that there's no effect. And he said that's not enough.
Clearly now, with the passage in Illinois, are you going to be paying particularly close attention to Illinois over the next few years to watch what happens, to help bolster some of your research, or just to give us the numbers?
I don't think it's going to you're going to see a huge impact from Illinois. And the reason is, and I've tried to be arguing this clearly, at least since the second edition of More Guns, Less Crime that came out in 2000, that there's large variations across these states in terms of concealed carry laws. Just because a state has a right to carry law doesn't mean one state's the same as another. You can compare someplace like Indiana versus Texas. Indiana has a population that's something like about an eighth the population of Texas, but it has about the same number, almost the same number of concealed handgun permits as Texas has. Well, why is that the case? And the reason is because in Texas, up until just, I guess, in the last week or so, you had to have 10 hours of training. You had to pay at least a $140 fee to get a permit. In Indiana, there's no training requirement. Fees fairly low, not as low as, let's say, Pennsylvania, where it costs about $20 to get a concealed carry permit. But those things matter a lot. Now Texas's training requirement's going down to 4 hours, but when it was 10 hours, and 10 hours required for retraining to renew your permit, that makes it difficult for people because if you're over 8 hours, it basically requires you have to go in for training on at least 2 different days. And that may not seem like a big problem to some people, but for a lot of people at the margin who are just saying, well, I don't know if I should have a concealed handgun permit or not, making them have to go in for multiple days of training is just a line too far for them to cross. And the thing is, with Illinois, they have a high fee. As I recall, I think it's at least $150.
Right.
And they require 16 hours of training. So they're by far the most difficult state among the so-called right-to-carry states for getting a permit. And so I think you're going to see a relatively small, I know the state of Illinois is claiming that 300,000 people are going to get concealed carry permits the first year. I think that's wildly too high.
I agree with you on that one because it's burdensome.
And, all they do is they just say, okay, similar-sized states, how many permits do they get? Well, that doesn't take into account that the similar-sized states that they're comparing them to have much easier ways of getting permits than with the new rules in Illinois. And the other thing is, Illinois has a long list of places like where you're not allowed to carry concealed handguns. And so if I can't carry it, if I can't travel on certain types of transportation or others to take the gun with me, and if I can't leave it in my car in my parking lot, and if I can't go and take it into a lot of other facilities that are there, it really dramatically reduces the benefits from me going and getting a permit. And so you combine all those two things together, the higher costs and the reduced benefits there, and I think you'll see some people getting permits, but it's not going to be anywhere near as what you should have.
I'm going to do this again. For instance, two of Lott's major critics, Donahue and Levitt, attribute much of the drop in violent crime that started in the 1990s to the legalization of abortion in the 1970s, which they argue resulted in the non-birth of vast numbers of children who would have been disproportionately involved in violent crime had they existed in the 1990s. The Lott Mustard studies did not address the Donahue-Levitt thesis. Lott and Mustard did account, however, for two peculiarly American phenomena, and this is where we started at the beginning of the show with John, American phenomena which many people believed may have been responsible for the 1990s crime reduction, the dramatic increase of the United States prison population, and the number of executions. The population in the United States tripled during this time period, jumping from approximately 100 prisoners per 100,000 in the late 70s to more than 300 per 100,000 in the general population in the early 90s. In addition, executions in the U.S. soared from approximately 5 per year in the 80s to more than 27 per year in the early 1990s. Some of that has probably a lot to do with Texas. John Lott, welcome back. Would you care to comment on that? To me, that theory sounds incredibly crazy. Is it?
Well, it's an old theory. It was something that if you go back to the 1960s and 1970s, it was very prominent. In fact, if you read Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court case, they actually mentioned the theory at that time in the majority decision. And it's this basic notion that if women have children that they don't want, they're not going to put the time and energy into raising them, and so therefore they won't grow up to be as good individuals or as strong individuals or as productive people as they would have otherwise, and more likely to be involved in crime. I'm willing to accept that there's something to that. The problem is, in theory, I'm willing to say that. The problem is that there were a number of mistakes that Donahue and Levitt made in their paper. Their data was bad. They had problems with their data. So, for example, they just assumed prior to Roe v. Wade, abortions weren't allowed in these states that were affected by that. And that's simply not true. Every state had some abortions. You may have had different levels, but in some states like Kansas, believe it or not, you had very high abortion rates. In Washington, D.C., you had very high abortion rates because the rules would always be if the life of the mother was in danger or the life or the health of the mother was in danger, you were allowed to have abortions, and it would be up to doctors or boards in different places. And in many states, when you could have a doctor make a decision, it would be very easy to find some doctor who is willing to say, yeah, your health is in danger or whatever, and they would let the abortion go through. So, we have kind of this mythology about what life was like before Roe v. Wade that's not exactly right, and they made mistakes. And the problem is when those mistakes are corrected, as I did in a paper that I described for people generally in the third edition, More Guns, Less Crime, their results are actually reversed. And the big thing that happened after the liberalization of abortion was actually a huge increase in single-parent families. And the thing is, one way to think about this is when you liberalized abortion, you had a big increase in premarital sex. We know that both from surveys as well as venereal disease rates. And the thing is, you have this huge increase in pregnancies that results from that increased sex. Now, you have an increase in abortions because of that, but you also have an increase in out-of-wedlock births. And what's happening is that imagine you have two groups of women that are there. One group of women are happy to have an abortion if they get pregnant, but another group of women just will not have an abortion if they get pregnant. But because there's so much premarital sex with the women who are willing to have an abortion because it makes it less risky for them to have premarital sex, because if they do get pregnant, they can have the abortion. It puts a lot of pressure on women who aren't willing to have premarital sex to do so, in the dating market to kind of get married. And so a lot of those women start having premarital sex when they wouldn't have had it before, and that's where you have the part of the problem, because when they get pregnant, they're not willing to have an abortion, and they're also, it turns out, those same women aren't willing to put up their children for adoption. Whatever causes them to have an emotional connection with the child to not have an abortion is related also to them not putting the child up for adoption. And so you have a lot more out-of-wedlock births. The women keep the children, and there's no longer the pressure on the men to do shotgun marriages, because before there'd be a lot of social pressure, but now they say, look, it's up to the woman. I'll pay for the abortion, but if she doesn't want to have the abortion, it's her responsibility. She takes care of the child. And so all those factors, the elimination of shotgun marriages, more out-of-wedlock births, the women keeping the children, not putting up for adoption, is a huge increase during the 1970s, this explosion in single-parent families. And a single parent, there's a huge amount of research that indicates that single parents just don't have the time to have a job and take care of the kids and do as much for the kids as they would have done otherwise. And children raised in single-parent families, after you control for lots of other factors, are more likely to engage in crime and other factors. And so, in fact, when you do the study right, you get the opposite of what they were claiming they had originally discovered.
That's fascinating.
Anyway, I have some discussion on that in the third edition, More Guns, Less Crime, but my book, Freedomnomics, has a much more detailed discussion of the facts there and the argument.
Dr. Lott, thank you so much. Perfect timing. I hate it that the hour's over. Thank you so much for giving us your time today. More Guns, Less Crime, third edition, John Lott. Buy the book, ladies and gentlemen. Think. You can find this information. Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy. Don't just take my word for it. Go get it and read the 40 pages. We're about to run out of time. John, about 5 seconds.
Okay. I have a new book coming out next week on judicial confirmations for people who are concerned about protecting Second Amendment rights. The courts are ultimately going to be where the rubber hits the road there in that case. And the name of the book is Dumbing Down the Courts, and I think people will find it very interesting.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Carry on, carry often, and carry everywhere, ladies and gentlemen. Don't leave your cave without your club.